Well, but it's the nature of the procession. If you proceed from the source that is a father, then you must be a son and an only son because of the nature of a procession. Have you ever heard the word procession?
Well, you see, the word responsible, it's in the word. Response. Able. You have to be able to respond. Part of what moral responsibility is.
Isn't even a vital song! But this is to go even further beyond.
Have you paid heed to the prefix pro in the word procession?
This is gonna be stuff like that. Like it doesn't. John, okay, as best I can make out what John Frame thinks about circularity. He thinks it's not, okay, in logic, according to logician orthodoxy in the West, question begging is not a formal fallacy. And what that means is it's not an invalid inference to conclude P from P. P entails P. So we can infer P, or so it's thought. The trouble is, again, so it's supposed, that it's a persuasive problem. And the problem is that that's not going to be epistemically valid. It's not a question of logical validity. It's just that it's not going to be epistemically valid. It's not going to be epistemically efficacious to go to somebody else and tell them conclusion, therefore conclusion. Because that person doesn't buy into any of the premises there. Your premise is the very thing that's in contention, so he's not going to be on the same ground with you. You got to find some common ground. You got to find some premises that are less contentious than the conclusion, at least, if not premises that are in common between you and your opponent. So I think Frame is probably working on that understanding, but he's also seeing a coherentistic notion in Van Til that consistency with the gospel, consistency with Christian theology is sufficient to warrant a lot of beliefs. And that tends to be confused with circularity. That it's true because it's compatible with Christianity, and it's compatible with Christianity, it's true. That would seem circular, that would seem problematic, but it's really just a matter of consistency. So he sees that, and his way of kind of putting together this coherence principle in Van Til and his notion of how question begging is a problem is to say that it's a matter of proximity. Everything that's true/knowledge is going to have a consistency relation, and that means that you can always have arguments that go around in a circle logically. But they work. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is just that's not persuasive. It doesn't work because the other person doesn't share the views in question. Or you're starting out with the contentious material and not moving from things that they're more open to. So you've got to broaden. That's why he makes this whole thing about broadening the circle or having a wider circle. Because I think his idea is the idea is to capture more elements, more premises, more whatever that are less contentious or maybe even common ground with another person. Because once you get them on that circle, it's like they're spiraling towards Christianity in their thought. You want to. It's like if you're driving on a road and it's muddy and there's ruts in it, you're trying to get them to fall into your ruts, because then eventually they'll circle around to your conclusion of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, all of these ruts go to one place. They all come back around. They're all circular. So it's just a matter of like widening the circle enough to capture your opponent and then draw him in to sort of narrow the circle. Are you following that like analogy? Is that making sense?
Yeah, I can visualize it.
Okay. Yeah. And I think that's problematic, first of all, just because I think question begging is a lot bigger a problem than people make it out to be. And I'm not sure where to look among philosophers for that opinion, but I can't imagine that I'm the first person to think that. But regardless, it just seems to me that, like, look, if we really think it's bad to say, I'm God because I'm God, or something like that, the reason why it's bad is not because it's unpersuasive. There's something fundamentally flawed about pretending to be God like that. There's something wrong about saying, I am because I am. What I think is true because what I think is true. Or something like that. We're treating ourselves like God when we do that. That's the fundamental problem. That's the problem with question begging. And that's not a persuasive problem. That's not a rhetorical problem. That's not an informal problem. That's a formal problem. That's just a problem with the very nature of the reasoning. Also, hilariously, Shotgun, of all people, he makes a great point here. You can just... people think to themselves in terms of having a debate in their head. People think to themselves by having internal dialogues and sort of, fake conversing with themselves. Does that mean that, like, as long as you avoid that method of investigating philosophy, that you can avoid question begging? But you can actually question beg against yourself if you think that way, and one of the voices in your head that you're espousing makes that kind of argument? But it's just kind of preposterous, right? Like, if you could question beg to yourself that way in this method of dialoguing with yourself, how would that be any different than just when you think to yourself at all? Why is thinking... why should I be more convinced when I think P is true because P is true, when I'm not thinking in terms of a conversation hypothesized in my head? But I should call it a fallacy if I run a little scenario in my head where I'm debating with myself, and one of my selves uses that P because P argument. That's just kind of stupid, right? Like, that is fallacious, and so I should think that doing it to myself at all is fallacious. All this to say that, like, I think question begging is a lot bigger a deal than Frame makes it out to be, and I appreciate Bonson that he tries to avoid it. He does a better job of being like, yeah, this is bad. We're not going to do this. Logical circularity is bad circularity. It seems to me that, like, logical circularity, and here I'm using paraphrase, right? Or parentheses. I'm making quotation marks with my fingers. So fucking stupid. I'm making quotation marks with my fingers when I say that, right? The only logical circular being in reality is God. And that's kind of like saying God is the only person to have free will, right? Even then, I don't really mean libertarian free will. Even then, I don't really mean question begging. I mean, when God thinks something, it just is. He doesn't have to think, I think this because I think this. He just thinks it, and that's the way it is. This is a straight line. There's no circle. But that's what it would be. That's the real quote-unquote question begging that would take place. If you could really think this is P because this is P, there would be no because. It would just be you think this is P, and therefore there's P out there going on. But you're not God. You can't do that. That's out of the question. So no logical circles for us. I think that's part of the issue. The other part of the issue is, like, transcendental arguments just aren't making that kind of logical movement. transcendental critique against an unbeliever is meant to sort of, it has this like revealing feature that when you successfully engage with an unbeliever and make the transcendental critique, what you're doing is showing that the whole time, from the very beginning of the conversation, he had come to the conversation with the knowledge of God in hand. And that's what was enabling him to do all of his reasoning and doubting and attempts to suppress that knowledge in the first place. He's like the man who shows up denying that he has a mouth and a tongue and a voice with which to speak. And he's doing all this talking all the while, right? And all you're doing is making an argument that tries to show, hey, you couldn't do any of that denial. You couldn't be denying any of that if you didn't have the voice, you didn't have the mouth, blah, blah, blah. All that speaking you're doing is just practically falsifying what you're saying. It's a performative error. How is that begging the question, right? What premise is repeated as a conclusion?
Yeah, it's bizarre because even Frame's own view wouldn't have that problem. Because even if you thought transcendental arguments are not distinct from direct arguments, they wouldn't be just reasserting the premises.
Yeah. Yeah, and what to make matters even more, to make Frame, and I love Frame. I think Frame shines his theology, not like apologetic methodology, but to make Frame even more inconsistent on this, and building on what you just said, is maybe just a nuance to what you just said. Frame and Pointers are very big on redeeming classical arguments. So if I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I've read his book, but I want to say Frame like gives an example or two of like how classical arguments could be reformulated in a Van Tillian way, and he doesn't seem to think those are logically circular. And supposing that he said they were, it would be very unclear how they are, because there's no premise that's repeated as a conclusion. Yeah. So the idea is that like the circularity going on is that, well, if it's epistemic circularity, then the issue is the content that is concluded, or like the referent of what is concluded, or whatever you want to call it. That's what's doing all the work to justify the premises. And Frame, I think, rightfully would go, yeah, that's what you would expect given a transcendental argument. A transcendental argument is just supposed to have the conclusion backing up the entire argument top to bottom. That's just the nature. This is how they work. So to say that as if it's an objection is like saying this can't be a square because it's got four sides. How is that a problem? But for the Frame's interpretation of that is going to be, yeah, but that's just logical circularity. And that's the part that's like, oh, no, it's not. One way to think about it, I don't want this to be, I want to be careful because this is not the end-all, be-all of the differences, but one thing you can point to is logical circularity is always internal circularity. Epistemic circularity is not. In the case of revelational epistemology, when God does things so as to make people know who he is and something of what he's doing and so forth, that's not me reasoning. I'm not reasoning at all to receive that knowledge. Some of it is constitutive of me. Some of it is given to me inherently, immediately. Some of it is waiting there as a historic object for me to interact with in the Bible, like any other book. But none of that is me like sitting down and deducing things. A logical circle is always an act of the mind. It is always a deliberate process. It's always internal. It's something that, in other words, the justification that is putative, the justification that it's supposed to be offering, is internalistic because it's inferential in nature.
Yeah, so that's a very important aspect. That it's a non-inferential knowledge. That usually is being a bit just like the beginning of that Bonson stuff we were just playing and stuff.
That's right.
Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense how that avoids because if circularity is mainly an issue of if logical circularity is obviously mainly an issue of deductions and inferential reasoning, then obviously with non-inferential justification, that's pretty hard to accomplish.
It's kind of like this is a very speaking of that article you gave where you talk about the incarnation, where Tipton talks about the incarnation being an analogy of inspiration, but only a very remote analogy. So also, this is only a very remote analogy. However, there's an analogy between grace and the law, and internal versus external justification here. It's the person who's trying to fault transcendental criticism or Van Tillian epistemology more broadly, because it's logically circular, is like a person who looks at justification by grace and saying that violates this or that commandment of the law. It's not under the purview of the law. It's extra law. It's outside the law. That's why it's grace. The law doesn't have anything to say about it. Because it's not a legal act. It's not a matter of justice. It's beyond justice. So here too, like, inference has no bearing. The rules of how to conclude something are off the table. That's not what we're talking about. You brought in the wrong rule set. We're not playing Monopoly over here. We're playing chess. Wrong rules. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just surprised Frame would make this mistake. Like, to be honest,
it's weird, right? It's weird. Or like when Frame, it gets weirder because then Frame's like, yeah, it's an ontological argument. Oh, it's painful. Oh, my soul. Ooh. Just what a blunder. Friggin' one of the most genius philosophical theologians of all time, and that is just a doozy of a mistake. Ontological argument. Whew.
Yeah, when it comes to apologetic methodology, he goes really, he's like, man, he has just weird ways of doing, remember, take his ethics view, right? Maybe because I've a lot of ethics I've heard from Frame, but, remember his, argument against, Christians committing the naturalistic fallacy?
I don't remember the argument.
Oh gosh, it's I remember you had a significant problem with it. Watched.
I thought Frame was the one who did really good at saying God is this special. I mean, I didn't agree with his wording maybe that much, but I thought the idea was basically right, that he thinks God is this special metaphysical entity that isn't reducibly descriptive or prescriptive. He is inherently valuable and therefore comes with obligation producing entailments.
Yeah, he said things like God is the norm or something. For this reasons, Christians may often seem to be reasoning from description to norm. God commands X, therefore I must do X. Is that a naturalistic fallacy? No, because we are not passing from a merely descriptive premise to a normative conclusion, because God's commands are supremely normative. The self-expression of God's supremely normative nature, they entail normative conclusions. And so is that what you liked, or I don't know, you had a problem?
Yeah, I don't know if I would put it that way, but I think he's. It sounds like what he's saying is basically right. The way I would put it is just that like there are certain there's a natural relationship between features of value which are descriptive. That's not to say they're not normative. It's just to say they are descriptive. And there's a natural correlation between those features of value and obligations, duties, responsibilities. They go both ways. If you got this responsibility, that presupposes values that correspond to those. If you've got values, then those naturally enforce or encumber people with duties. And none of, on my view, right, none of that's going to work unless there's this supreme value. There's this intrinsic value that is God, the one who is inherently worthy. I think Frame is just saying something. It's like when Frame says there's two existences of God. I don't use that language, but it's not. I don't think it's entirely wrong either.
Right. It's just kind of like weirdly put. I get it.
Yeah, he has a weird way of talking about things, but I think he's usually basically right. Like his triperspectivalism, I think, is like overdone in that he like seems to rely on that abstract idea more than he should to try to confront different topics and address different problems in completely different fields of philosophy. But it also doesn't seem entirely wrong. It seems like he's basically onto like how there's a Trinitarian backdrop to everything, and I think it does really well in ethics. I think he's entirely right that like ethically, you can't really make sense of ethics without this like triune economy of law, wisdom, and normativity, or whatever. I don't remember his three things, but like you've got like a deontic aspect, you've got a consequential aspect, and you've got a virtue aspect, and there's not really a way to put that together very well if you don't have the Trinity. One of his, okay, I'll give him credit this. Every time I have used, not only do I think this is good in and of itself, every time I have used it in a conversation, it has landed very well. And that is the way Frame handles the problem of evil by emphasizing the contrast between Old Testament knowledge of God and New Testament knowledge of God. That is like maybe like the most, I don't know how to describe it. It's not as like big or widely, it doesn't have all the same level of ramification as like his two existences view or his triperspectivalism. Those things have like an effect on anything you believe in if you believe in them.
Mm-hmm.
But the way he like goes back and he's like, look, imagine you were an Israelite and somebody comes up with the problem of evil, blah 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 blah. Now imagine like, so you can see like how this develops over the course of time historically, people learning more about God, learning more to trust him, blah blah blah. That's just so genius. Like, no, who else has thought of that? That's so good. Because it's so true, right? Like, imagine you were Adam and Eve. You don't have all this history. You don't have all this Bible. But God would still be trustworthy, right? Well, then imagine you're Abraham and you've got even more stuff. And then imagine you're freaking Isaiah. You got even more. Now we get all the way up here to Christ, who's put down the devil on the cross, and he's offered us, like, are we really in a position to question God then, when we weren't in the first place? I just think that's a great rhetorical framework for thinking about the position, the issue more humbly.
Yeah, like, we don't have a good track record.
No, we don't.